a few weeks ago, I was talking to Michelle, and she said about tower houses, and I know that you have tower houses in the likes of Cumbria, and I know that you've got them in Orkney. And my description of a tower house is a building that is different from a castle, that is different from a manor house. It's different from a mansion. It's a large tower that stands. It can support itself. It's got rooms. It's sort of semi-defensive. It's got very limited access, a number of windows, and it's usually quite tall. And we've actually got these in Wales. And then I started looking at the same formula when I was looking at Cornwall. I found one or two in Cornwall, not many in Cornwall actually. So when I started looking at the tower house across Cymru, I realized instantly that I had known what a tower house had been for many years, because when you go to the Gower, for example, Oxwich Castle and Wobley Castle are tower houses, right? Mm. They're big, sort of big towers. That's what they are. And they're usually built in about the 1400s. And then I realized that if you look at Candleston Castle, that's not really a castle or a manor house, it's a tower house. And I thought I'd known what these had been for years. And then I'd also visited Powys Castle. Not Dinas Powys Castle, but Powys Castle in the County of Powys. And that's a tower house. And then another building that I'd always passed on the way to Caerwent, i.e. It's hang on a minute, I've lost the hang on a minute, I've lost the name of the place. It's on the way to Caerwent. Penhow, that's the one. Sorry, I couldn't remember it. I have a blonde moment now and again. Penhow Castle. I'd looked at Penhow from the road, and that's a tower house as well. I'd always thought it doesn't look like a castle, but it's a tower. It's just a tower. And if you think of it by itself with nothing else around it, it's a tower, and it's got everything about it. And that's what a tower house is. That's what I've sort of understood over the years. So when we think about tower houses across our own land, another description of a tower house, go into my notes, is a fortified stone house. That's what a tower house is. As I said, built from the 1300s onwards, and really popular up until about the 1600s. And then by about the 1600s, you're building mansions, and very much like Llantrithid Place that I've mentioned a number of times, like Dunraven that we've mentioned a number of times, and those types of mansions that are up and down our land, which are either still standing there today or have been torn down. So you've got tower houses, a number of them in Ireland, a number of them in Scotland, and you've got a few, but quite significant ones in Cumbria. And you've got one or two in Orkney, and the ones in Orkney, I know Bill and Peter's actually seen them with me without realising that they're tower houses. And then I struggled when we got to Cornwall, but I did manage to find a couple. So the main concentration of tower houses seems to be in Pembrokeshire. We've got a few in Pembrokeshire, so we're going to look at one example in Pembrokeshire. And most of these tower houses are either still lived in or they're very much in a ruinous state, like much of these things from the medieval period. And the one that we're gonna really look at in West Wales is known as the Old Rectory. It's at a place known as Angle. So to give you a little idea of the ones across our land, and we won't do the same with everywhere else, but I'll just mention we've got a couple in Pembrokeshire, and if you're trying to find these on the map, or if you're looking these up on the internet, they're actually marked the Tower. So we've got two in Breconshire called the Tower. Denbighshire in North Wales, we've only got one. Carnarvonshire, we've got a couple of examples. Flintshire, we've got one. We're going to look at the one in Flintshire actually, and guess what that's called? The Tower. So it's quite easy to find. We've mentioned the three in Glamorgan. We've mentioned Wobley, Oxwich, and Candleston, but it's likely that there are more of these tower houses across the landscape that maybe are not in this list because they're sometimes confused with being castles. One or two demolished, like the one in Merionethshire in North Wales, and we've got Powys in Montgomeryshire that we've mentioned, and the ones that have survived have been inevitably changed and made into very much later Gothic revival type buildings. We've got a couple in Monmouthshire, including the one at Penhow. And in Pembrokeshire, you've got a whopping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You've got 10 in Pembrokeshire and the one at Angle that we're going to look at. So what I'd like to do is I would like to look at this one that actually takes us to Orkney straight away. This is at a place known as Noteland. And Noteland is on the island of Westray, and it's like that typical type of tower building. And the reason why I've got interested in these buildings is they're very much the type of thing that you see and you connect with when you're looking at the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. You know, you always get a building like this when you've got the Jacobites in Scotland, and they're always called castles or something else, but they're typically referred to as tower houses. But we're not doing the ones in Scotland. We're just going to look at Orkney. And you say, well, Orkney's part of Scotland, Carl. Actually, when you go to Orkney, they don't see themselves as being Scottish. So again, what you see is that sort of typical corbellin as it projects out at the top of the wall here. And interesting enough, you've got all these little tiny windows, not large enough to crawl through, but enough for ventilation and enough to use to see out, and just a little bit of light. So, and they're really dark buildings inside. Actually, all of them are really dark buildings because they've not only got a sense of being able to live in them, but they've also got a sense of defense and storage and keeping things safe. So you've got little doorways like this, and this wonderful one at Noteland itself, which I'm going to give you a little bit of detail. There it is from, again, Orkney, but it looks very Scottish in the way you look at it. So it's in one of the islands called Westray, and it's probably one of the only major islands in Orkney that I've not actually been to. So when you look at these tower houses, for example, in Scotland and Orkney, they're a little bit later. They're sort of a different fashion, away from the 14 and 1500s where you actually see them in Cumbria. They're in a different wave of building in Scotland. In Orkney, they set another need. This one's particularly from the 1500s. And the tower houses that do survive are usually protected and scheduled. So the ones that are gone, but the ones that are still with us, because there aren't thousands of them, basically. There are thousands of castles, but there are not thousands of these tower houses because inevitably they've been demolished or changed or moved around with. And usually when you look at the likes of Scotland, for example, this tower house itself is associated with when it was built in the 1560s. And it was associated with being granted in association with the Bishop of Orkney. And when you think about Orkney, it's very much of a type of landscape in the 1600s that has these little sort of sub-kingdoms within the island of Orkney, which is at the same time, which is part of Scotland. So the word rectangular main block or square main block in some of the other descriptions, that's when the rectangular main block. But usually what happens with these tower houses is that they've been added to. So there you go, Noteland Castle. Again, the word castle is a bit of a misnomer because the word castle seems to hide a number of different ills. You can see the word castle being used for lots of different buildings across our landscape, which are not necessarily castles. You know, in relation to Candleston Castle, that's a tower house, not a castle. In relation to also another example near Aberthaw in the Vale of Glamorgan, you've got a location called East Orchard Castle. It's not a castle, it's a manor house, and it's not a tower house. You see what I mean? You've got to be very careful with the word castle. So you're looking there on this building, and you can clearly see that it's slightly different from a castle. And you can clearly see that the main hub of the building is that large sort of rectangular, it's described as a Z-shaped building over in the right there. And one thing that me and Bill, when we were in Orkney the first time, we visited a ruinous building very similar to this, where we were staying in Stromness, and it was, you looked at it and it wasn't a manor house. It wasn't quite a castle. It was similar to this, and maybe what we were looking for on the map, I think it said castle on the map or something, and we didn't find a castle. We found something like this, but a lot smaller, and inevitably they've been added to. And if they've survived, they've become naturally, like Penhow, something much more impressive. So what I'm gonna do, guys, I'm gonna take a quick pause in what we're doing. So Michelle's just arrived, so if you can bear with me a minute, I will be back. And sorry for the inconvenience. I'll be back in 3. Now, when we look at the range of buildings that we're going to do, I'm very aware that I've got 8 to do. So we'll keep looking at these impressive individual nature. Again, I wanted to do something different today. I wanted to see another expression of history and archaeology. And the other thing with these buildings is when you think about the archaeological content with these buildings, you start to think, well, most of them have either been, you know, they're still being lived in, and most of them haven't been archaeologically excavated, which is a bit of a shame. And again, the impressive nature of these types of buildings, and they're usually loved, and they come into the sense of poetry within a landscape, within a poetic landscape that these actually belong to. And lots of these buildings, because they're meant to be individual, and because they're meant to be self-supporting, you get these types of wonderful structures in them, these types of great vaulting passages for storage. You can imagine back in the day, in the late 1500s, barrels and barrels of wine, and whiskey and kegs of beer and cheese and all the rest of it in these great vaults. Because the other thing as well is the other thing with these buildings is not only just for defense, is not only just to impress, is also because lots of the landscapes that these buildings are within can be very bleak, and it's good to have all your supplies in one spot, and you get a nature of that. It's almost as if when you're within a building, within any of these buildings, you're away from the outside world, because you can get an idea from that image there that it's a very distant landscape, and when I say a distant landscape, you're far away from anybody else, particularly on an island like Westray. So what I did, I sort of went slightly overboard with these images, and hopefully I'll get through them all. But when we talk about sort of a tower house like this, you can sort of see a bit of a plan. So you've got an entranceway there, you go in to these stairwells, you've got these different layers, and it's a sort of a Z shape. So again, when you think about a tower, a rectangular or square, or odd shapes, but it's all integral, it's all linked, it's all one building, and looking down on this building as well, and being that a part of it is still being used today within this really interesting landscape of Orkney. Like, all these landscapes are very, very interesting. So what I would like to do now is go somewhere completely different. And lots of these places most of us won't have visited. So we're visiting a completely new place now. So am I thinking that you're actually seeing the ruined remains of a building? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. And there it is. We're now moving on to Cumbria. As I said, this was supposed to be a comparison of these different buildings. And what you will see is sort of little comparisons that, again, with the previous building at Notland in Westray, it is one building that would have at one stage stood by itself, would have had everything to do with the solar, the accommodation, the storage, the servants. You know, it would have had, and that looks quite defensive as well. And again, it's not a castle. It's not built at the period of castles. The period of castle building across Britain is from the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, and then you get the last castle building into the 1200s, and that's it. And then you've got manor houses being constructed and huge estates, and then you get these tower houses being built. So the age of castles is gone, and now you've got a new expression. Because the other thing as well is, when you're looking at these types of towers, it's within a sense of a local mind. So what we're talking about, this is not going to defend against a huge army. This is meant to sort of, again, show off your wealth, a bit of defense, a bit of everything. And this is what these buildings are about. So if there it is, we're going to look at Burnside Hall. This is in Cumbria. And sort of this sense of a ruin, and what you can see is that these modern buildings into these really tall walls, utilizing the old masonry, which is 700, 600 years old. And again, more of these images, and you're looking down on this building, again, this big square structure. So let's give you a little bit of information about it. So Burnside Hall is a ruined tower from the 1300s, but there's a name for this tower, and I actually come across it when I was actually researching the tower in Cornwall. And I'm not sure I'm going to get this pronunciation right. It's a Peel Tower, a P-E-L-E tower, not Peel as in the 1800s, but a Peel Tower, P-E-L-E tower. And it's a specific name for the types of towers that are being constructed. So and the other thing as well is, with lots of these towers, we've got dates. Now, the example in Westray was in 1560. This example is in 1341, because there's lots of there's lots of records. And interesting enough, this Pell Tower, or Pelly Tower, or however that word is pronounced, the fortification of the house was licensed in 1341 when the tower and the gatehouse was built. So you still needed permission to have a tower like this built. But again, it's very different from a castle. It's not meant to act like a castle, because when you get to the 1340s, and by the time you get to the 1400s in particular, a tower like this is not going to stand out against something new. For example, into about 1400, 1410, 1420, you've got cannon being used. So a building like this is not going to stand up against a cannon, for example. So you can see the differences now between what a castle is, this, and what a mansion or a large manor house is like. And it's describing that you've got this itself was constructed and the name given to it from Gilbert to Burnshead. So this building is known as Burnside Hall, and it's named after the founder, Burnshead. And the other thing as well with these towers is that as opposed to, for example, castles, people live within these towers for decades, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they've got a longevity. Where you look at a castle, you know, a castle's built. And then if we want to look at the example of Ogmore Castle, for example, in the Vale of Glamorgan, the lords at Ogmore Castle probably lived there a decade or so, and then they moved on elsewhere. And then they had an attendant there. Well, these these buildings again, and that's another point to be made. Trying to put a lot into this tonight. This is the seat of a family, right? This is where a family is going to live. This is where a lordship is going to be based. Because when you think about castles in the medieval period, for example, the lords of Declare would have had castles all the way across Glamorgan, all the way across Gwent, right? And they may have lived in one castle for a year, and they lived in another castle for another year, and they forgot about that one, and they didn't even know where it was, and they lived in that castle. And this is what castles were about. People moved around, and it was for defense, and we're here, right? They weren't family homes. And these were actually family homes, and this is the big difference with these types of structures. Like Cornwall, there are not many of these tower buildings in existence anymore. Most of them have been demolished. Most of them have been lost, and they've seemingly disappeared in time. They've been unloved, and just chucking in something else. The walls of these towers, because they're quite tall, need to be fairly thick. This one, the walls of this one are 1,200 millimeters in thickness, so 1.2 meters in thickness. Doesn't sound massive, but it's quite a chunky thickness of a wall. And interestingly enough, the family that originally constructed this lived here for 200 years, and then, so this is in the 1300s. So the family disappeared, and then another family moved in. And they remained at this, people still remained at this site for about 500 years. So they're used for a very long period of time. And the ones that do survive with roofs on and all and everything there tell great stories, tell really intriguing and interesting stories about the past. So when you look at these structures, and I think with a tower house, you get other things that you don't expect, like these little sort of these little type gateways, which are not defensive, but rather interesting that in time, the tower house has become a farmhouse, and there's a gateway and there's a wall, and they've all been added to. Isn't that really quaint? It's the type of building that we could sort of all live in and sort of do up and have a nice roof and so on. But again, all these nice little attachments, but these have come later, because initially the whole purpose of these buildings is to be insular. And when and not talking, not expanding too much, when Michelle and I went to Shetland, we visited the island of Mousa, which is where they've got that big Brock tower there, which is 12 meters high. And there was this big sort of square building with about 4 or 5 floors in it, which had been abandoned about 150 years ago. And that's all it was. It was just a big sort of building and no outbuildings. Again, a tower house. This is what these are. And again, they've become very poetically shown and described throughout history, because the one thing about a tower house is that they've remained in use. And if they've fallen into ruin, it's sort of in that antique sort of poetic period of the 1800s. So sometime in the 1700s, this building started to be unloved, and the farmhouse was where people lived, and so on. And then it gets a little bit more poetic. So it's now a ruin now, the original tower house, but it's still there, nevertheless. Again, little sketches over the years from the 1700s. You can see it's still there in the 1700s. So where are we going to go to next? Now we visited one site in Orkney, we visited one site in Cumbria, and now we need to go to West Wales. Now, when I was doing research for these structures, initially I was typing in tower houses, and I thought, right, tower houses Wales, I'm not getting anywhere. And then I started realizing that there's different names for them. And then I come up with this word, the Pele Tower, the P-E-L-E Tower, and that's another name. This is the one that we're looking at now. This is the one in West Wales. This is the one in Pembrokeshire. Again, that Pele Tower, and a specific name for these towered buildings. I had no idea that they were called that. So if as we look at this one now, you can clearly see this really tall, slender tower. And in a way, what they are, they've got these sort of newel staircases on the sides. You've got that nice little newel staircase. We saw that at the one at Knowlton when we looked at Westray, and where there's got this newel staircase going up. And we've got that, this example, the Pele Tower here. And this is a site known as the Old Rectory in Pembrokeshire. And there it is inside. And rather interesting, everything is inside. Must have been huge timbers to be used inside these buildings. And when you look at this, actually, I haven't got an image to show you, but when you look at this, if anyone's ever been to Wobley Castle, you go into Wobley Castle and it's like ruinous, and there's like rooms and fireplaces there and all the rest of it. It looks like this. So again, not a castle. You know, even when I was a child, I thought, I went to Wobley Castle and I said, this is not a castle. Yeah, it is. It's a castle, and it's not a castle. I don't know what it is. And then it turns out to be a tower. It's a Pele Tower, a nice little bit of an image of it there. And so we'll read out the bit of description. It's known. It's the Pele Tower in Angle in Pembrokeshire. And I can show you where it is in a moment, I do believe. Oh, there it is. There it is, Pembrokeshire. So nice. So if we go back to that, so the Old Rectory, the Pele Tower. So what's happened is that it's become also known as Castle Tower, because the farm near it's called Castle Farm. Are you okay there, Pete?
I say I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's apparently it was called you've got the Castle Inn as well. So I don't know if that's still going. If that's why you know it's there.
No, when I was out at Angle, and I've been to Chapel Bay Fort, and I was going through the village of Angle, and you can see it.
And does it look as impressive as my image that I've shown?
It does look quite impressive at the time. I remember driving past and looking at it and saying, well, that's a pretty enormous building, and yeah, not realizing then what it was. You
didn't think anything of it, exactly, because it's yeah. Sometimes if it's not marked on the map, it is a type of building which is these buildings. You've got 10 in Pembrokeshire, and you've got like 25 odd examples in Wales. I can't remember how many I mentioned, but that's not many compared to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of castles in Wales. So they are quite rare, really. And this one itself was constructed in 1429. So again, it's within that 1400s. And it's got parallels with similar towers in Ireland, because this is what you got. You've got lots of these towers in Ireland, lots of them in Scotland. And it has been suggested that it was the residence of the Lords of Angle, which hence gives its name to the local area. And in a way, it's more. It looks rather impressive because it looks out at across the landscape over the tidal creek of Angle Bay. And until the 1930s, there were remains of a second building with a vaulted undercroft of similar dimensions. But this has now completely disappeared. So you think, oh, right, there was another building, and it's got the nice parapeted walk and the crenellations and the corbels and the turret. And again, it's a very interesting structure, and I'm so pleased to be able to bring these to you tonight. It's something rather different, and then it sticks out there. You can see the really nice projecting corbels on the outside, old-looking corbels. You know, they're really powerful. You don't usually see corbels like that. And do you know what? And actually, one interesting thing. And I think it's missing from the list, actually. And the first time I actually met Gough, right? Gough was with Dennis, and they come along to a guided walk in Llanmace. And in Llanmace, it's got Malafant and Llanmace Castle marked on the map. Just as Llanmace is north of Llantwit Major. And there's a building that's very similar to this behind some houses, and it says this is part of the remains of a castle, but it's not. It's more like a tower house. And it was built around the same time, actually. So that's missing from the list. So there's probably more of these tower houses than we know, or they've been misconstrued with the name castle. It's really quaint, isn't it? It's really nice. And it's a shame we can't look at these individually. But what you can actually look is that you can see these really nice narrow windows with the one behind me as well. Really little narrow tight windows. So this is, I wanted to show you this because this is what I found. The Peel Tower, you can't call them Peel Towers because a Peel Tower is something else, as Pete will tell you. It's a defensive building, which is from the 1800s. So if you spell it like that, P-E-L-E, a small fortified keeps or tower houses built along the English and Scottish borders. Well, that's actually wrong because this is in Pembrokeshire. They were freestanding with defence being a prime consideration of their design, with confirmation of status and prestige also playing a role, and a few other things that I've mentioned. They also function as watchtowers where signal files could be lit by the garrison to warn of approaching danger. Now, actually, I'm struggling with that last line because lots of these towers are for families. And obviously the garrison, there may have been a little garrison in there that was associated with the family. But that's basically what a Peel Tower is. Now, oh, come on, Pete. This is in Cornwall. Do you know where this is?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. No.
Pengersic Castle.
Oh.
Now, the other thing I'd like to say is, and do you know what? We'll probably run over a little bit tonight, might be, but this is known as Pengersic Castle in Cornwall. Now, it looks very much like a church, actually. But it, again, what gives it away as one of these towers that we've been describing? You've got a little bit of a newel staircase in the back there. And what you've got here, you've got these little tight little windows. And yes, it looks like a church, doesn't it? But this is one that's being used today. And it's, if I go to my notes, see what my notes tell me, Pengersic Castle. And before anyone shouts out, where is it? There it is, Pengersic. It's the other side of Cornwall, as I say, not the nice size Penzance. So
it's between Delston and Penzance anyway, so I should know it.
You should, but then again,
yeah,
you may have mistook it as a church. I would. It looks like a church. Anyway, it's a tower house. It's not a scheduled ancient monument. It's a Grade 1 listed building, which gives it sort of a nice bit of status. Now, this little bit of a description here. It was originally built in 1510, so it's in with the sites in Cymru, sort of in that earliest, well, maybe a little bit later. So this tower house is of a late medieval date and features one of the few towers of its type preserved in Britain. And it was described in 1814 as there are considerable remains of an ancient castellated mansion on this estate of Pengersic Castle. Christ. The principal rooms in which are made use of as granaries and haylofts, one of them, but this is in 1814, which is nearly entire. It's wainscot in panels. So we described what a wainscot was last week. Well, this was on my Thursday class. A wainscot is a wooden paneled wall. That's what a wainscot is. And the upper part of the wainscot is ornamented with paintings, each of which is accompanied by appropriate verses and proverbs in text and hand. So, and bit of a history about this. 1510, built by a certain William Worth. The Worth, it basically by the 1400s, 1500s, the old manorial world was dead. When I say dead, we'd have had the plague, you know, the manorial power was waning, and then we were coming a little bit after that into the period of Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries and all the rest of it. Things were changing. So castles were not the thing. These types of buildings were in some places, and great manor houses were the types of things as we see in the Vale of Glamorgan. Great manor houses were being built, but those that wanted to build a structure like this would. So it's basically a description of another description is near Jamo, but nearer the sea is a very fine remnant of a castle.
Remote.
Hang on, we got a disruption a minute by the connection unstable. Am I sounding okay now? Good.
Yeah.
Near Jamo, yeah, is that right? Jamo, but nearer the Jamo is a very fine remnant of a castle. So this is why we get these buildings confused as castles, because they're described as castles, but they're not. It was erected in the time of Henry VIII. Well, obviously 1510, you know, we're getting into that period. And basically, Perguesic Castle was then improved in the 1530s and could be described as a fortified manor house. And if anyone's into their ghost stories, they need to look at this one, because there's legends of devils, wives being poisoned, plague pits, black dogs, smugglers. And this building, without saying any more, is one of the most haunted buildings in Britain. But we're not doing a ghost evening, but Pete, maybe we should visit this in a ghost evening sometime. That would be rather useful. So again, looking at that building, it again misconstrued as other things, quite easily misconstrued as a castle or misconstrued as a church, but it's obviously been quite changed over the years. A nice array of images. So that gives it, that one at the bottom really sticks it out as a tower, as a really nice, impressive tower, but obviously altered and changed, but it's loved and people live there today. And again, if I wanted to, I don't think this is a good survey, but if I said, in proportion, the amount of these tower houses in Britain that still stand, that are actually still lived in, as opposed to them being ruined, and then compare that with castles that are still lived in, tower houses in proportion would win, because they're more comfortable, and they're more enclosed, they're more in one locality, and people love them. Very poetic. So number 5, where are we going to go for number 5? Now, when Michelle, I had to bring Michelle into this, because Michelle mentioned these tower houses, and I thought, right, if I'm going to do any of these tower houses, I need to find one that's got a loose link with a noble family of our land of Cymru. I need to find one, and the one I actually found is in northeast Wales. So I got my notes up here, so I'm just gonna, so there we go. It's near Chester, and if we look at a few images and we look down on it, it's a rather impressive building. But what is this building that we're actually looking at? So let's go to my notes and let's see what, this is a listed building. It's not scheduled. And this one is also called the Tower. So there's a bit of a giveaway. But if you do look up on the internet buildings that are called the Tower, be very wary. The word the Tower is a popular name for bed and breakfast in Britain. So the Tower, Mold, Flintshire. It was built in an interesting period. The Tower, or known as Bron Coed, is first mentioned in 1465 by the poet Lewis Glyn Cothai, which would mean Lewis Glyn Cothai. I had the translation for that it went out of my head, who described the murder here of a certain Robert Brine, linen draper and ex-mayor of Chester, by the owner Renalt Gruffydd ap Bleddyn. Renalt Gruffydd ap Bleddyn. You can't get a more Cymru sounding name than that, Cymraeg name than that. So the fortified tower house, which gives the place its name, is the earliest section and is probably from the 1440s, 1450s. So these are quite some of the early ones. It acted as a semi-fortified solar tower. Now, the word solar, if people don't know what that word is, associated with accommodation. So when you go to a castle and it says that's the solar, that's the accommodation. So that's what I was saying. It's about that sort of integral building altogether. And this was entirely rebuilt in the 1600s, but the ground plan of some of it's still there in the 1600s. And basically in the 1600s, what they did, they started adding more chimneys and more entrances and more this and more that. And this in turn was considerably altered in the 1700s. So it's loved. It's still used today. And again, you know, I keep using this word poetic and artistic, because these buildings are either being used today or and were around in the 1800s and they were loved, or they had just become ruins in the 1800s. These are the types of things that people would write poems about, and these are the type of things that people would like to draw and paint and fall in love with, and do tapestries and sort of and have that great sort of connection with the past. And there's a great watercolor by a painter known as Moses Griffiths in the 1780s, and he gives all the detail. And the other thing as well is the wonderful thing, and it's a shame Richard isn't with us this evening, because he loves all this type of thing, and he does a lot of research in the publication known as the Archaeologia Cambrensis in 1846. And the Archaeologia Cambrensis used to love writing about these types of buildings, where it would go into this being a tower block and this being changed and now Gothicalized and the buildings and all the rest of it. So if you want to learn about these tower houses across our land of Cymru, look up Archaeologia Cambrensis, and there's lots of details about these buildings in those publications, because these are the types of things that they that would be in those publications, because lots of the members would be subscribers of the publication in the first place. So you can imagine, come to my house, survey it, write about it, make plans about it. There you go. So we'll look at a couple more images now. So again, it's been changed, but you can tell the sort of romantic link that these tower houses have. And this is, you can think of this one of those peel buildings where you've got that sort of bit of a staircase, that sort of central area that obviously being expanded in the 1600s and changed and so on. And you've got that building there. You can see where that comes into the tower house. It's sort of become very Gothic and very changed, and again, sort of that nice poetic photographs in the late 1800s with that shine of the mirror effect on the lake. Again, you can see where it's got its mysticism, and in many ways, actually, this is another good point to make. That when people are actually when you go to the changes with Church Castle up near Llangollen, and when you look at Cyfarthfa House in Merthyr Tydfil, you can see that they're getting some influence from these buildings alongside influence from castles and other things to build their structures in the 1800s, because these buildings are inevitably still around, and they're thinking, right, that looks good, but we'll put big windows in it instead. And again, looking inside, we haven't looked at lots of these insides. You can imagine that that vaulting as well, that sort of sense of that sort of barrel vaulting to sort of keep the ceilings up and all the rest of it. And you can do that because it's a smaller space with a type of building like this, rather than a large hall that you might see with a castle. So you know what? I don't know who was talking about a building earlier on, and I wanted to tell him to be quiet, and I didn't, and something else happened. This is a building that I always would love to have been looking around, because I used to live in Arnside. This is a building in Arnside. This is known as the Arnside Tower, and I always used to pass it in the car when I used to go to a village called Silverdale. I used to go between Silverdale and Arnside in Cumbria. It was a weird part of my life, which I don't talk about a lot, but I've got a lot of life experience from it. So I wanted to do these towers because I wanted to do this tower, and this is also a pilly tower. So the word pilly tower, these types of towers across the land, a very impressive building between Arnside and Silverdale. Arnside Tower was built in the late 1400s, and I really wish I'd have gone around this building. So there's Arnside there, in the bottom part of Cumbria, and look at that. You can clearly see that these buildings, right? Okay, all the other ones that we've seen more or less have got buildings around them today. So this is what these buildings were meant to be like. They were meant to be in these types of localities, all alone, nothing else around them. So this isn't something out of Battle of Culloden or something. This is in Cumbria, South Cumbria. So this is You can see the small windows at the bottom, and obviously they've enlarged the windows. And again, within that landscape, and when you drive past it in the car, it's very much alone again. You know, it is a building that you feel you want to see, but you never ever actually get out there. So this is again, it's said that lots of these were being constructed in the late 1400s in connection with the threat of people from the north of Cumbria and southern Scotland, known as the Borden Reivers. And the Border Reivers were a group of people, were a group of lords that took justice and everything into their own hands. They were above the law. So this tower itself is 50 foot in height. The dimension is about 34 feet square by the sides. And this is built in 1464. And by a chap by the name of Lord Hastings. You can't make it up. So the problem here is with these types of buildings, and one thing that I haven't mentioned is the risk from fire. So obviously, if you've got stone vaulting on the ground floor and you've got stone vaulting, you've inevitably got a lot of timber as well. And all you need is, because everything's in one, you've got the kitchen, you've got everyone living there and so on, and little banquets and stuff. Inevitably, there is going to be a risk from fire. So this building, like some of the others that we've probably seen, accidentally burnt. This was burnt in 1602, but it remained in use up until at least sometime by the end of the 1800s, and by the end of the until the end of the 1700s. But by the end of the 1800s, it was still there. Nobody lived in it. But bits of it started to collect by the 1900s, but English Heritage have fallen in love with this building. However, it's the one that's loved. There are two others. One was demolished, which would probably make Michelle very angry in the background, but another one's in a bit of a ruinous state. But this one is still with us today. It's a scheduled ancient monument and a grade 2 listed building. It's in private ownership, and it says the local tourist board recommends that good views of the tower can be made from the public footpath which runs alongside. So it's not suggesting you actually go to it, and I wouldn't suggest. But it looks really imposing and really powerful type of building. And when you look at it from inside, all these different types of windows I mentioned that look out, and you can see that. Loads of little bit windows, as many little windows as possible, but not big enough to actually crawl in through. And you can put bars on these windows and all the rest of it. You can actually still see that you've got evidence of the newel staircase on the right. But it's very much overgrown. So what you do see from the road is this side, and you can see the other side as you go to Silverdale. Really, really interesting. And again, that type of corbelling on the top there, that really nice set of corbelling. And you look, and they're very ghostly buildings actually. I would have again a regret in my life that what I'm going to do is plan to take Michelle up there on a holiday just to see this building. Very spooky looking building. I was just wondering if there's any ghost associated with this one. So we've got two other buildings left, and we've got a weird little one for Cornwall. We've got to end with a weird little one with Cornwall, but we've got one left. So where have we been now? What is it? I think we've got Orkney next, and the other one's quite unusual. Should it be in my list? So who am I going to catch out with this? Bill, where is this? Hang on, I'm going to unmute you, Bill. Where is this?
That's South Wales somewhere, isn't it?
Nope. You've been there with me 3 times.
Oh, bloody hell. Not Tree Tower, is it? No?
No, where did I get Captain Gown by Princess Anne?
Orkney, yes.
Kirkwall, that's looking from the tower. You've been on the walk in the tower above. That's looking over the Bishop's Palace.
Bishop's Palace, yes.
See, there you go. So I never actually went into the Bishop's Palace, but it's an unusual one. It's in my list. For example, if we go back, if I go to my lists year, or list now, these are the tower houses in Orkney, right? Bishop's Palace, Kirkwall. This is classed as a tower house built in the late 1100s, associated with the 1136 building of the cathedral itself. And you've got another tower house known as Kirby Roos Castle, which is on the island of Wyre. And you've got Naltland Castle, which we've seen. And we might have the Earl's Palace at Bursay, which Bill's also been with me, and Balfour Castle on the island of Shaponsay. And those are the only tower houses that we've got in Orkney, but they may have missed one or two of them. So well, if I mention a little bit of detail about this building, we'll just sort of show you another image, actually. That's where we are in the center, in the beating heart of Orkney. And yes, it's a tower house. This is all it was meant to be. It's got the typical sort of projecting towers on the side there, and it's just an L-shaped plan, and that's all it is to it. That's all it was meant to be. But it's got a round tower on this one. But again, the similarities with the other buildings. Can you see those little windows there? They're exactly the same as the other tower houses that we've seen. So that's what makes it a tower house. And this is what it is. It's all in there, all the rooms, all the floors, the kitchen, the solar, the storage, it's all there.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Exactly. You can remember it now, Bill.
No, I can see it on the roof of the cathedral, yes.
Exactly. So originally it is thought to have been, it was classed as a Norwegian palace, but it has come down to us as being a tower house for the Bishop of Orkney. And also the other thing as well is another thing that I've completely missed out. If you watch these films about Scotland and sort of Rob Roy and anything like that, you always see tower houses coming into it, and you always see a hall, and it's in that sort of tower house the king always stays, right? And actually, this tower house would have been the biggest, most impressive building in Kirkwall and that part of Orkney, and it would have been the place where the king would have stayed. So King James V of Scotland would have visited Kirkwall, and he would have stayed in this tower house, and he could be nicely safe in there, but have the luxuries and have all the privileges bestowed upon him as king in a building that was fit for purpose. Because castles are not fit for purpose by this time. By the time you get into the 1500s, the 1600s, they were very not to be. And this is why lots of castles were being abandoned by this time. So again, as we see things and as we see things change, and do you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to do something rather silly. Now, when I was looking at the list of these tower houses in Cornwall, I was really struggling. So I actually come up with something by accident. This is classed as a tower house, but it's a folly. That's the red herring. And this is the last building we're going to look at. And this one is in our beloved Cornwall. So let's tell us something about this building, and then we'll call it a day. So I was looking up, and you know when you look things up on the internet, you go off on a tangent, and it said Tower House, and I thought, wow, this is known as Rogers Tower. So this dates from the 1700s, and obviously very different from all the other buildings. It was built as a folly. But then again, it may have actually been lived in by a certain John Rogers of Trousseau in 1798. So I thought, right, let's just, if I can't balance this out tonight, let's just put something bizarre and silly in there. So so there it is. It's at St. Columb Major, directly near an Iron Age site. Castle and Dinis, and there it is. And again, it's sort of it follows that sort of tower house mentality where you've got this sort of little building. And in many ways, I've never really done any lectures on follies and so on. Maybe that could be a lecture for the future. But you start to think that by the time of the, and there's a real important point to be made, Joe, looking at this, even though it's a sort of a silly image really, and a silly site to actually use. By the time, and that's the last slide, by the time we get to the late 1700s, 1800s, the age of the castle was over. The age of the old worldy manor house was over. It was the new age of the great mansions and the great estates like Blenheim Palace and Kensington and so on and so on. But if people wanted to go back to the old ways, they might wish to not embody a castle, but they might actually wish to embody a castle tower, because a castle tower, you could put windows in it and make it look nice and comfortable, and you could have all the services and everything in there. And in many ways, if you want a demonstration of what I'm talking about, if you go to the likes of St. Fagans and you see St. Fagans Castle, if you look at it, it's one building. It's just one building, and it's a big, tall building. And it's got everything in it: the kitchen, the tapestries, the butler, the solar. It's got corridors, it's got toilets, right? That is a fairly modern embodiment compared to the buildings we looked at that could be described as a tower house and not a castle. And that's where I'd like to end today. And that's Roger's Tower, Pete, if you ever want to see it. Castle Ann Dinas, A-N Dinas, not Ann Dinas, Ann Dinas. So if you ever want to visit, that's Roger's Tower. It's by the site itself. And I might actually take Michelle there when we next go down to Cornwall. So we could have a nice little picnic in there, couldn't we? So anyway, what I'd like to do is I would like to bring us all back to where we are, stop sharing, and let's open the mics. Actually, I've mentioned you a lot, Pete. Anything you'd like to say tonight?
Well, when the first ones you showed us,
yes,
the way those looked as if the accommodation for living in was in the upper reaches of the building.
It would have been.
The under reaching obviously were used for storage and possibly heating, and the upper reaches would be warmer because of the rising warmth from the lower regions. May even have livestock down below.
And the other, I would agree with all that. I would actually completely agree with everything you've said. But basically, these tower houses are, in a way, they learned everything about castles, right? They learned about how to build castles. They built the defensive. They understood the defensive nature. They understood by the time fireplaces inside walls are coming in, not in open halls. What they're thinking is saying, how can we bring all this together in one building? How can we think about a Norman keep, but have it with everything in it? And this is what a tower house is. So, and these would have been rendered on the outside and whitewashed and everything. So they would have been quite cozy, actually. But the other difference between a keep, and another huge difference between a keep and these towers, is that there's no real apertures for windows on the lower coursing of a keep. It's all sort of, it's meant to be, a keep is meant to be completely defensive. So they've learned from everything and they put it in this tower house. And the thing is, what you could say is the tower house design is very practical as opposed to a castle. Yes. And I like the thing about warmth, that was, yeah, you know, when you're doing something like this, you got so much to do. Yeah, good. Goff, anything you'd like to say?
No, it's very interesting. Some nice pictures as well. Thanks very much.
It was good. And actually, I've done an area today of buildings that most of them were new to me. So that was good. Ellen, what would you like to say?
Yeah, it was lovely. The buildings are absolutely superb. And it's obvious they were built for an important reason, because they're sort of specific, really nicely built and large. You know, even if they were a family home, they are quite large, aren't they?
And if you would have said lasted, you would have had a complete set there. Yeah, all that. Yes, all of it. Exactly. I agree completely. Pat, go on, Pat. You didn't say anything. You don't say anything in my lectures anymore. It's as if you're not there. It's as if you're fast asleep. Go
I'm
on.
here. It was interesting. Yes, I hadn't thought about tower houses, but I have been to Penhow, so I know exactly what you mean. It's
You know,
really
can I ask you that question? That, you know, when you go to Penhow, does it feel like a castle or does it feel like something else?
Nope, it's like my house. The house they made it into a home.
That's it. Because it's a tower. You can't really convert a castle into a house, but you can have this as a house. That's the point. Bill.
Yeah, on my travels through South Wales in particular, Carl, I've seen buildings which, on reflection, were tower houses, even though they've been modified as such. One or two things come to mind. On the Van Estate in Caerphilly,
And house.
there's a wonderful dovecote there, which is the biggest in Wales. And next to that is the original building. You know, it's been extended, but I'm pretty sure that was a tower house. The other one which comes to mind is you mentioned Pembrokeshire. On the road from Halford West to St David, on the right-hand side is Roch Castle, R-O-C-H.
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain that's a tower house as well. It's not that big. In fact, they do hospitality, things like that. But they are dotted around the landscape, but sometimes, as you mentioned, they are disguised because they've been actually extended to form bigger buildings, etc., etc. But yeah, they form a very important part. I'd like to know actually exactly what the history of each one was and who the lords of the manor were, because there must be a difference between a manor house and the tower buildings, as you say. Did a tower building evolve into a manor house? Another theory, possibly.
Well, two things about that. You were right about Roch Castle. That is a tower house. That's on my list. In Pembrokeshire, we got Angle, Carswell, Eastington, Bonville Castle, Priory Farm, Roch, West Tar Farm, Kingston Farm, Sandy Haven House, and Sisters House, all in Pembrokeshire.
The walk there's now. The walk there.
Yeah, there's a nice chunk there. And
Tree Tower. There's something about Tree Tower as well.
Actually, I do believe that. I've got the tower at Skethrog and the tower at Talgarth, and I'm thinking of. I think you are right about Treha Tower. I think you are right. I think you're right about that one. Yeah, because I've seen Treha Tower. That's in my head. It is definitely there. I think you're right. Yeah. And Rosamund.
Well, I was just thinking what Bill just said. You know, did the towers evolve to the manor houses? And they seem very French, sort of Norman in their history.
Yeah, carry on. That's the point I want. Yeah, carry on. Go on.
I was just going to say, interesting that there's a lot in sort of Scotland and Ireland, and not so many in the south. We've got a few. Interestingly, sort of West Wales, where there seems to be French influence.
Exactly. The one thing that I want to jump in is this, Bill, right? And you've mentioned it as well. There is one difference between a tower house and a manor house, right? This usually tower houses were not built in the same places as the manor houses, because the manor house is for another purpose. The manor house is to control a village, right? A tower house is nothing to do with controlling a village, because by the time you get to the 1400s, 1500s, these tower houses were within a different economy, right? The medieval economy was based on a servile economy, that you've got a lord of the manor, a village, and everybody is reliant upon the lord of the manor, and that's where the income comes from and all the rest of it, right? But by the time you get to these tower houses, the people are replaced by sheep and cattle. So you don't need villages. And therefore you can take this building and plonk it anywhere. And actually, in most cases, particularly with the Arnside Tower, there are no houses around it at all, because they're meant to be standalone. They're meant to be controlling the landscape, and that's the point. You don't need peasants around you to have this building, where a manor house is integral to the village, and the village is integral to the manor house. That's the difference. And that is an answer to a very interesting question. I like that question. I like that, as you can tell. If there's anything else you wanted to say, Rosamond, because I was interrupting what you were saying, but if there's nothing else.
It linked in with my question.
Good.
But it does seem very Norman French based, doesn't it? You think of the chateaus of France.
Yeah, if you think about it, you are very right there. There's the final point there, and I'm going to mention what we're going to be doing next week. The final point there is when you think about these tower houses, when you get into the 1500s in Scotland, that's when there's a lot of French influence in Scotland. There's obviously a lot of French influence in England, Ireland, and Cumbria, and obviously Cornwall in an earlier stage. But there's a lot more French influence in Scotland later on because of the royal family intermarriage and interrelations with Spain and France in Scotland later into the 1500s. So that I've enjoyed
One thing
that.
I would like to say.
Go on, quick, Pete.
A friend of my son-in-law down on the Cleddau, down by Haverfordwest, he is restoring one of these places, and I'm sure because there are 2 towers attached to it, I'm sure it may well be a tower house, and he's restoring it. I'll have to find out from Ty who he is, and I've had some photographs of it in the past. I don't know where they are at the moment, but I'm sure that would qualify as a tower house.
Do you know what? I do believe I know the one you're on about.
It's got its own jetty onto the Cleddau.
Stop showing off. I want you to find out more.
I will.
So next week we're going to go back to the Iron Age, and next week we're going to do an area that I know this is a thing that I really like. We're going to be looking at Iron Age villages, not Iron Age villages under the ground. We're going to be looking at Iron Age villages that you can see from the surface. We'll be looking at the one at Holyhead. We'll be looking at 1 or 2 in Cornwall because there's lots of Iron Age villages in Cornwall. We'll be looking at 1 or 2 in Orkney, and hopefully I can find 1 or 2 in Cumbria, which is going to be my challenge. So yes, if nobody else has got anything they would like to say, then I've enjoyed it tonight, and hopefully you guys have as well. And Ellen, I want to allow you to have a say. At the beginning, you were asking something weird about Orkney. Have they got mosquitoes in Orkney? The answer is...
Are the midges out in June in Orkney?
I believe...
In August.
August, right, okay.
This month, yeah.
That's when we avoid going to
You
Orkney,
need
to be
something
honest.
from Avon. Skin So Soft from Avon.
Right, okay.
It does. That actually, it does.
Yeah, good.
Keep the midges away.
Yeah.
On that note,
your local Avon agent would have it.
right, I wish I hadn't even bothered.
An Avon catalogue.
Right, stop. What, everybody stop now. What I'm going to say good night now. So, Goff, good night.
Bye-bye.
Night, Goff. Ellen,
Bye-bye.
Pat, Rosamond, Bill, and Peter. And thanks for that tonight. Night, guys.
Thanks, Carl. Good night, all.
Bye-bye.
Another great evening. Thanks
Thank you.
very much.
And you
Bye.
guys killed it off with the
Bye.
bloody mosquitoes. I wish I hadn't bothered now.
Well, when I was up there, my daughter was an Avon rep. She said you must take some of this when you go to Scotland and Orkney, and I took it, and I did wear it at one point, and I was walking across to a loch to find out about fishing in the loch, and as I walked past this chap, he said, "Oh, Skin So Soft," and apparently they all use it because it is so effective.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to Scotland, you've got to bear in mind the midges, haven't you?
That's right. That's absolutely right.
On that note, guys.
Good night.
Yeah, right. I'm going to call this a night. I need to. Oh, God, I need a cold shower after that. I wish I hadn't bloody bothered in future, Ellen. Keep these bloody things to yourself. Anyway, good night, Ellen. Pete, bye.
Good night. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Flippin' heck. Hey, I'll tell you what, Pete, and you, Bill. Night-night.